The mountain is groaning. Deep below the grand halls of the dwarves, a tremor shivers through the stone. Master rune-singer Thrain Stonehand presses his chisel against the unyielding granite of the grand spire. This is not an act of construction, but one of desperate preservation. He carves the final protective runes, defying the Dwarven Lords who commanded him to build opulent new halls instead of reinforcing their shaking home. He risks everything to save his people from a prophesied fall. By the end of this tale, you will uncover the secret of the lost Songs of Stone and understand how a single voice can challenge the might of an empire. I wonder where you are listening from right now, and what the local time is where you are. What forgotten truth could possibly save an entire civilization from crumbling into dust? The crack in the rune stone echoed through the silent council chamber, a jagged black line splitting the ancient, glowing sigils. Thrain held the heavy stone aloft, his hands steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He had pulled it from the deepest foundation pillar, where the mountain's pain was most acute. "My lords," he said, his voice low but carrying to every carved throne. The stone itself is screaming. This fracture is not from age, but from a fundamental sickness. Our expansions have stressed the living rock beyond its endurance. For a moment, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic drip of water and the uneasy shifting of the assembled lords. Then, Lord Boren, his beard braided with gold and his eyes cold as flint, rose from the high seat. He did not look at the fractured stone. He looked only at Thrain. "You bring this rubble into our sacred chamber," he began, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "You speak of sickness and screams. I hear only the desperate lies of a rune-singer who fears his own irrelevance. You would have us halt our glorious works, our legacy, because of a single crack. This is not a warning, Stonehand. It is fear-mongering. The decree was swift and absolute. Thrain Stonehand was declared a bane to progress, his words a poison to dwarven spirit. He was stripped of his access to the inner chambers and the deep libraries, banished to the outer halls. As the guards escorted him from the chamber, a low tremor shook the very floor, causing dust to sift down from the vaulted ceiling. The lords dismissed it as a minor settling, but Thrain felt its true meaning in his bones. It was not a settlement, it was a reply. His banishment was meant to silence him, but it only confirmed his deepest fear. The real danger was not the groaning mountain, but the deafness of those who ruled it. The heat of the lower forges was a constant, oppressive weight, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and scorched metal. Thrain worked the bellows, his exile a deliberate humiliation. Yet here, amidst the industrial clamor, he was closer to the mountain's raw pulse than he had ever been in the polished council chamber. One day, while inspecting a fresh load of raw adamantine ore, his practiced eye caught a glimmer that was not right. There, along the face of the primary adamantine vein itself, ran a hairline fracture so fine it was almost invisible. This was not just any stone. This was the mountain's structural heart, the unbreakable spine that held all the weight above it. His blood ran cold. He traced the crack with a soot-stained finger, feeling a faint, unnatural vibration. Ignoring the shouts of the forge master, he followed the fissure as it snaked behind a stack of slag and discarded tools. It led him to a narrow gap in the rock wall, hidden for centuries by accumulated debris. With immense effort, he squeezed through into a small, cool alcove, untouched by the forge's fire. The air was still and carried the scent of old dust. Light from a glowing moss revealed a mural painted eons ago on the smooth stone wall. The pigments were faded, but the story was clear. It depicted the first dwarven ancestors, their hands not holding hammers or chisels, but raised in song. They were not carving runes of command, but singing them into being, their melodic notes flowing into the living rock like water. The mountain in the mural did not groan, it resonated, answering their songs with veins of light that pulsed in harmony. This was the truth. The original songs of stone were not a myth. They were a communion, a symbiotic language of request and gratitude, lost when the lords chose domination over dialogue. Thrain stood before the ancient art, the weight of his discovery settling upon him. The salvation of his people would not be found in stronger supports or deeper minds, but in a forgotten melody. He had to learn the song before the final note of the mountain was a scream of collapse. The faint hum was a ghost of a sound, a vibration more felt than heard. It led Thrain away from the forges, down into the abandoned tunnels known as the Echoing Caverns. Here, the great works of the Dwarven Lords were just a memory. The air grew cold and still, the only light coming from the pale, dormant lichen on the walls. He followed the resonance, a thread of harmonic truth in the overwhelming dissonance of the mountain's groans. The cavern opened into a vast, dark space where his every footstep seemed to be swallowed by the emptiness. And there, seated on a simple stone slab, was a figure so still he might have been carved from the rock himself. It was Kalen, an ancient stone speaker long believed to have perished. His eyes, milky with age, opened slowly, and he spoke without turning. His voice was the sound of grinding pebbles. "You have been listening to the pain," he said. "Not many do anymore." Thrain stood frozen, his mind racing. Was this the wisdom he sought, or the ramblings of a mad hermit driven deep by solitude? Kalen had done nothing as the mountain decayed. He had simply watched. Distrust warred with desperate hope within Thrain. To trust this outcast was to risk everything on a ghost from a forgotten age. To dismiss him was to turn his back on the only answer he had found. Thrain made his choice. He bowed his head, a gesture of respect from one singer to another. "I would learn to listen," he said. Kalen's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He gestured for Thrain to sit. "The first song is not one of power, but of empathy," the old one whispered. "You must feel the mountain's agony as your own. Listen." Kalen began to hum, a low, complex melody that held no words, only raw emotion. It was a song of immense weight and profound fracture. As Thrain listened, something shifted. The distant, abstract groaning of the stone sharpened into a focused, searing pain in his own soul. He felt the unbearable pressure on the adamantine spine, the slow, sickening tear as the fracture widened. It was not just observation, it was shared suffering. Tears he did not understand welled in his eyes. When Kalen fell silent, the memory of the pain lingered like a fresh wound. "You have taken the first step," Kalen said, "but this fragment is only a beginning. To mend the break, we must find the rest of the lost songs, scattered and hidden by those who feared their truth." Their alliance was forged not in fire, but in shared sorrow. The quest was no longer a solitary one, and the path ahead looked more perilous than ever. The path Kalen chose led them downward, into a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. They moved through tunnels untouched by dwarven hands for centuries, the air tasting of ancient dust and undisturbed water. Their goal was a place known only in crumbling scrolls, the Chamber of Echoes. It was said that within its perfectly spherical hollow, a single note could be held forever, bouncing between the walls in an eternal conversation with itself. When they finally squeezed through a fissure into the chamber, the space was not what Thrain expected. It was not grand or ornate, but small and unnervingly perfect, its walls smooth as polished glass. In the center of the floor stood a single, trembling pillar of rock, its surface webbed with fresh, hair-thin cracks. This was the heart of the local instability, a point where the mountain's agony was concentrated. Kalen gestured to the wall, where a single, complex rune was carved, its lines dull and lifeless. "This is the rune of resonance," the old stone speaker murmured. "It is a lock, and the song is its key. Hum the fragment I taught you. Focus not on power, but on harmony." Thrain took a steadying breath, pushing aside his doubt. He closed his eyes and began to hum the low, aching melody of shared pain. At first, nothing happened. Then, a soft, golden light began to pulse within the carved lines of the rune, growing brighter with each sustained note. As the light intensified, a corresponding hum filled the chamber, a deep, answering vibration that thrummed through the stone under their feet. Thrain watched awestruck as the fine cracks spider, webbing the central pillar, began to shimmer. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the fractures started to knit themselves back together, the stone grinding softly as it fused. The violent shaking that had plagued this part of the deeps subsided into a gentle, stable hum. They had done it. They had not just stopped the damage, they had reversed it, but the cost was immediate and severe. As the last note faded from his lips, a wave of profound exhaustion washed over Thrain. It felt as if the energy required to sing the note had been drawn directly from his life force. He staggered, his vision spotting, and leaned heavily against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The glow in the rune faded, leaving the chamber stable, but dark once more. Kalen placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, his expression grim. "The song does not command the stone, it persuades it," he said quietly. "And persuasion requires that you give a piece of yourself in return." This small victory was a revelation, a tangible proof that the old ways held real power. Yet as Thrain fought to regain his strength, a new fear took root. If mending one small pillar demanded so much, what would it cost to save the entire mountain? Unseen in the darkness of a high crevice, two pairs of eyes, glinting with a sharp, intelligent light, watched the entire event. They had seen the glow, felt the stabilization, and noted the crippling cost. Then, as silently as they had arrived, they retreated into the deeper blackness, carrying word of the rune-singer's dangerous discovery. The sharp clang of armored boots echoed from the corridor above, a sound entirely out of place in the deep, silent archives. Thrain's head snapped up from the dusty folio he was studying. He knew that rhythm. It was the sound of the Lord's Guard, and they were not here for quiet contemplation. He shoved the heavy text back onto its shelf and snatched up the small, carefully wrapped resonant crystal he and Kalen had just unearthed. its faint inner hum a precious secret. As the guards' voices grew louder, their orders clear, he acted on pure instinct. From a nearby display case of common geological samples, he grabbed a similarly sized piece of inert quartz. In one fluid motion, he wrapped the quartz in the same silken cloth and placed it in the empty space on the research table, slipping the true crystal into a hidden pocket within his tunic, just as the guards stormed into the chamber. Their commander, a dwarf with a face like granite, barely glanced at him. By order of Lord Boren, all artifacts of questionable origin are to be confiscated for the security of the realm, he barked. The guards began sweeping shelves clean, tossing ancient scrolls and delicate mineral specimens into iron-banded chests with a shocking lack of care. One of them seized the cloth-wrapped decoy from the table, and Thrain's heart hammered against his ribs. The commander's eyes narrowed, lingering on Thrain for a moment too long before he turned and led his men away, their mission of cultural pillage complete. Thrain stood amidst the ransacked archives, the silence they left behind feeling heavier than any noise. He had saved their most vital tool, but the decoy was a lie, and lies against the throne are a crime with only one punishment. He was no longer just a banished nuisance. He was now a thief, an enemy of the state. His mission had just transformed from a desperate quest into a race against his own people's chains. The deep mining charge detonated with a sound like the mountain's own bones breaking. The resulting tremor was not a distant groan, but a violent, rolling shockwave that threw Thrain against the stone wall. Dust choked the air, and for a long, terrible moment, the only sound was the settling of unimaginable weight. Then, the screams began. The main trade tunnel, the great artery of the city, had collapsed. Panic was a living thing in the cramped side passage where Thrain found himself, but his mind was already cutting through the chaos. He knew the Lord's rescue efforts would be slow, methodical, and utterly useless against the sheer tonnage of rock. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were trapped, their air running out. He had to act. Gathering a small band of volunteers whose fear was outweighed by their desperation, he led them toward the sealed tomb of rubble. The official rescue teams were still assembling their drills and supports, their methods bound by engineering and caution. Thrain had only a theory and a fragment of a lost song. He pressed his hands against the cool, unstable rock face and closed his eyes. He did not sing for mending this time, that would cost too much. Instead, he hummed a single, pure note, a harmonic pulse his teacher Kalen called the seeking tone. He poured his will into it, not to command the stone, but to ask it a question. The note traveled through the granite and shale, a vibration seeking an answer. For a heart-stopping minute, there was nothing. Then, a faint, dissonant echo returned from a specific point deep within the collapse. It was not the clean resonance of solid rock, but the chaotic feedback of a pocket, a void where the structure had failed. "There," he said, his voice hoarse. "They are there." He guided the diggers, his song acting as a divine dowsing rod, pinpointing two more voids where trapped miners tapped frantically on the rock. They broke through to the first pocket, just as the air was turning toxic, pulling out 37 dazed and coughing dwarves. He repeated the process, his strength waning with each pulse, until 73 souls in total were brought back from the brink. The celebration was immediate and electric. Thrain was lifted onto the shoulders of the miners, a hero who had defied the impossible, but the triumph was short-lived. In the stark light of the emergency lamps, his methods had been laid bare for all to see. He had not used a drill or a map. He had used a song, the same forbidden art the Lords had denounced as madness and myth. The crowd, once united in relief, now fractured before his eyes. Some looked at him with awe, calling him the mountain's voice. Others backed away, their faces etched with suspicion and fear, whispering the word the Lords had taught them. Sorcery, the public display could not be ignored. From his high balcony overlooking the rescue site, Lord Boren watched the entire scene, his expression unreadable. The people were divided, and a divided populace is a threat to any ruler. He could no longer dismiss the rune-singer as a lone heretic. Thrain had forced his hand. The Lords would now acknowledge the threat, but they would do so by framing it as a dangerous power that needed to be controlled, studied, and ultimately possessed by the throne alone. The celebration around Thrain was a fragile shield, and it shattered the moment he was alone. In the quiet of a disused ore chute, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Lady Anya stood before him, her fine silks smudged with the same dust that coated his own worn tunic. She was Lord Boren's niece, the pragmatic mistress of the Citadel's largest forge works, and her presence here was more dangerous than any cave-in. "I saw what you did," she said, her voice low and devoid of the courtly pleasantries he expected. "You did not dig, you listened. My forges sit directly over the main Adamantine Fracture. My workers are terrified, and my uncle offers only more steel supports, which are already straining. I can give you something you desperately need. Safe, secret passage through the deep ways. The old transit tunnels are now heavily guarded on my uncle's orders, but I know the patrol routes and the forgotten grates. In return, you will use your understanding to secure the foundations beneath my forges." Thrain studied her face. This was no believer in the old songs, but a realist who had seen the limits of brute force and now sought a different tool. To trust a member of the ruling family felt like madness. It could be an elaborate trap, a way to lure him into the open for a swift arrest. His solitary mission had been pure, if desperate. Allying with her would tangle his purpose in political necessity and personal debt. Yet, her offer was the key to moving freely, to reaching the other hidden places Kalen had spoken of. He saw not an ally of conviction, but one of shared desperation. His cause could not survive on secrecy alone. It needed reach. "I accept," he said, the words feeling like a gamble with his life. Her nod was curt, all business. The alliance was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared assessment of mutual need. Her influence provided him with detailed maps and a small, trusted crew of her own smiths who could act as lookouts. For the first time, Thrain had resources beyond his own two hands, but this new advantage came with a razor's edge. Every time he used Anya's passages, every time he met with one of her people, he left a trace. The Lord's Guard, already hunting for the archive thief, now had a new puzzle. A forbidden power was not just loose in the deeps, it was being hidden, and someone with high-level access was pulling the strings. The noose, once distant, was now being drawn tight by the very hands that sought to help him. The maps Lady Anya provided were a lifeline of ink and parchment, leading them through dripping, forgotten transit tunnels that bypassed the Lord's guard entirely. The air grew heavy with moisture, the stone underfoot giving way to slick, algae-covered steps that descended into a profound chill. Finally, they reached a massive, ornate archway, its carvings worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. Beyond it lay the Sunken Library, a vast, dark cavern where the ghostly shapes of submerged bookshelves stood like drowned sentinels in the still, black water. The only way forward was through it. Kaelin pointed a trembling finger toward the center of the flooded chamber, where a single, dry island of rock held a pedestal, faintly visible in the gloom. "The key to the next song is there," he rasped, his voice already strained from the journey, "but the water itself is the lock." Thrain understood. He could not swim the murky depths, not with the weight of his gear and the certainty of hidden dangers. He had to ask the water to move. He knelt at the water's edge, closed his eyes, and focused. He recalled the seeking tone, but he reshaped it, pouring his intent not into finding a void, but into creating one. He sang a single, clear note of parting, a harmonic command that spoke of ancient paths and dry passage. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the surface of the water shivered. With a low, powerful groan, the black water began to pull back from the center of the chamber, peeling away from the stone floor, as if two invisible, colossal hands were pushing it aside. A path of damp, ancient flagstones was revealed, leading directly to the central island. The walls of water on either side towered over them, held in place by the sustained vibration of Thrain's voice. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence of the parted sea. On the pedestal lay not a scroll, but a heavy stone tablet, its surface etched with the flowing, melodic lines of the second Song of Stone, the Song of Unmaking. But as Thrain lifted the tablet, a deep, resonant hum filled the cavern, a sound that did not come from him. The water walls shuddered. From their shimmering surfaces, three massive forms coalesced, pulling themselves from the liquid itself. They were the library's guardians, ancient water elementals, their bodies shifting from translucent to a deep, angry blue. They had felt the unnatural manipulation of their domain, and they saw it as a violation. One of them lunged, a limb of solidified water, slamming down where Thrain had stood a moment before. There was no time for songs or subtlety, only survival. Kaelin shoved Thrain behind the pedestal as another elemental struck, its blow shattering the stone where the old hermit had been standing. "We cannot fight them," Thrain shouted over the roaring water. "We must flee," but the path was already collapsing, the water walls trembling, about to crash down and drown them all. Kaelin looked at Thrain, his milky eyes filled with a terrible, final resolve. He stepped into the open, directly into the path of the advancing guardians. He opened his mouth, but he did not sing a note of harmony or persuasion. He screamed. It was a raw, discordant shriek of pure sonic force, a blast of sound that tore from his throat with the cost of his very essence. The wave of invisible energy struck the elementals, not destroying them, but stunning them, freezing their liquid forms solid for a precious handful of seconds. The shockwave also shattered the delicate harmonic balance, holding the water at bay. The walls collapsed with a thunderous roar, the cavern flooding instantly. Thrain, clutching the stone tablet, was swept back through the archway by the churning torrent, gasping for air. When the water settled back to its original, placid level, The library was once again a submerged tomb. Kalen was gone. Thrain dragged himself onto the dry steps, coughing up water, his body trembling not from the cold, but from loss. He turned and saw the old stone speaker, leaning against the tunnel wall, his face ashen. Kalen tried to speak, but only a painful, airless rasp escaped his lips. He had sacrificed his voice, the instrument of his art, the source of his connection to the stone. It was gone forever. Thrain was now truly alone. The weight of the songs, the hope of his people, and the memory of his teacher's sacrifice settled onto his shoulders with a crushing finality. The next song would have to be sung with his voice alone. The stone tablet felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Alone in the hidden alcove, Thrain traced the etched symbols of the second song, the Song of Unmaking. As he began to hum the low, complex melody, the notes did not just leave his lips, they sank into his bones. The world dissolved around him. He was no longer a dwarf in a cave. He was the mountain. He felt the immense, fiery pressure of its birth, the slow, patient cooling, the first trickle of water carving out its secret veins. He felt the gentle, curious touch of the first singers, their harmonious notes, coaxing forth veins of metal and crystal, a request met with a gift. Then the memory shifted, turning dark and sharp. He felt the brutal bite of the first deep core drills, the violent shock of mining charges, the relentless, greedy hunger for the rare, shimmering ore the Lords called sun steel. This was no gift from the stone. It was a theft, and with every chunk of the radiant metal torn away, a sickness was released. The sun steel was not just rare, it was inherently corrosive, its magical resonance poisoning the surrounding rock, weakening the adamantine spine from the inside out. The mountain's groans were not just from stress, they were the cries of a living thing being poisoned. The vision shattered, leaving Thrain gasping on the cold floor, the memory of the toxic resonance burning in his mind like a fever. He now held the undeniable truth. The Lords were not just arrogant, they were actively killing their home for a fleeting power. A white-hot fury rose in his chest, a desperate urge to storm the council chamber and scream the truth into their proud, unlistening faces. But the memory of the divided crowd during the rescue held him back. An accusation of this magnitude, without irrefutable proof, would not bring reform. It would bring the clash of hammers. It would ignite a civil war, dwarf against dwarf, while the very ground beneath them crumbled. The cost of confrontation was too high. His fury cooled into a grim, chilling resolve. He could not accuse them yet. He had to gather more evidence, a tangible piece of the poison itself, to show the people what their leaders had truly done. He wrapped the tablet and hid it away. From that moment, every tremor that shook the deeps was no longer a distant warning. It was a fresh wave of nausea. Every groan of shifting stone was a pain that lanced through his own spirit. The mountain's agony had become his own, a constant, shared suffering that he now had to bear in silence. The shared burden of the mountain's pain was a constant, grinding weight in Thrain's soul. He could no longer afford the slow, careful search for knowledge. He needed a weapon, a truth so undeniable it could shatter the Lord's lies. He found Lady Anya at their prearranged meeting spot, a disused ventilation shaft overlooking the roaring, incandescent chasm of the High Forge. "I know what they are mining," he told her, his voice raw. They are poisoning the mountain for a metal called sun steel. The proof is in the forge's own heartstone. We need a piece of it. Anya's face, usually a mask of pragmatic calm, paled. The High Forge was Lord Boren's personal domain, protected by his most loyal guards and a personal sorcerer who sensed magical disturbances. To go in, there was to walk into the dragon's mouth, but the tremor that shook a fine dust from the ceiling at that very moment was her answer. She gave a sharp nod. I can get you to the core chamber, but I cannot shield you from what happens after. They moved through the steam-wreathed underbelly of the forge, a world of hissing pipes and blinding heat. Anya's knowledge of the maintenance crawlways was flawless, allowing them to bypass the patrolling sentinels. The core chamber was a terrifying sight. In its center pulsed a massive, crystalline heartstone, a conduit that focused the mountain's geothermal energy into the forge fires above. But the stone was sick. Veins of a brilliant, corrosive gold, the sun steel residue, spiderwebbed through its structure, pulsing with a feverish, unnatural light. This was the source of the poison, the infection point. There was no time for stealth. Thrain placed his hands on the shuddering crystal. He closed his eyes, shutting out the fear and the oppressive heat, and began the Song of Revelation. It was not a loud song, but a piercing one, a single high-frequency note that sought not to persuade or to mend, but to expose. The note sliced through the corrupted heartstone, and for a single, blinding moment, the entire chamber was illuminated with a terrible, honest light. The golden veins flared, not with beauty, but with a malevolent, searing intensity, their toxic resonance laid bare. The beautiful sun steel was revealed for what it was, a glittering cancer. But the ritual was a beacon. From a balcony high above, Lord Boren's sorcerer, a gaunt figure named Morwen, snapped his head toward the light, his senses screaming at the unauthorized use of profound magic. Alarm bells clanged through the forge, their sound swallowed by the industrial roar. "Go," Anya shouted, as the thunder of armored boots echoed from the main entrance. Thrain slammed his pick against the heartstone, and a shard the size of his hand, veined with the damning gold, broke free. They fled back into the maze of pipes, the steam now their only ally. Morwen did not give chase himself. He simply pointed, and a wave of superheated steam, directed by his will, shot through the corridor they had taken. Anya, bringing up the rear, was caught in the edge of the blast. She cried out, stumbling as the searing vapor scorched her back and leg. Thrain caught her, pulling her arm over his shoulder, half carrying her as they ran. Her breath came in ragged, pained gasps, her weight a new and terrible burden. Their escape was no longer a clean victory. It was a desperate, limping flight, with Thrain now irrevocably bound to the survival of the wounded noble who had risked everything for a sliver of the truth. The searing heat of the forge still clung to Thrain's clothes as he stood in the cavern's hidden grotto. Before him, the most influential clan elders not wholly loyal to Lord Boren waited in tense silence, their faces illuminated by the single glow moss lamp. He did not speak of rebellion at first. Instead, he unwrapped the shard of the corrupted heartstone and placed it on the flat altar rock between them. Its golden veins pulsed with a sickly, hypnotic light. "This is not treasure," he said, his voice echoing softly in the chamber. "This is the poison. It weakens the adamantine spine with every ounce they tear from the mountain." The lords are not just misguided, they are breaking the oldest oath, the one sworn to protect the stone that protects us. He looked from one weathered face to another, seeing the conflict in their eyes. He then made his plea, not for himself, but for their home. We must stand together and demand they relinquish their power, he urged, not with violence, but with a united front. We must show the people the truth and enact a peaceful coup before the final collapse. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant, ever-present groan of the mountain. Then Elder Durin, his beard woven with iron rings, symbolizing his clan's long history of mining, stood. His loyalty to tradition was a chain he could not break. You speak of oaths, Stonehand, he boomed, his voice thick with disdain. Yet you ask us to betray the ruling council, the very heart of our law. You are not a savior. You are a traitor, using forbidden magic to shatter our unity when we need it most. With that, he turned and strode from the grotto, a third of the elders following in his wake, their expressions hardened by fear and duty. The remaining elders looked at Thrain, their resolve tempered by the damning evidence before them. They were fewer now, but their conviction was forged in the same fire. The Dwarven people were irrevocably split. Thrain's hope for a grand, unified stand crumbled into dust. He was left with a smaller, more dedicated band, those who had seen the glowing cancer in the stone and could not unsee it. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they were the only shield left between the mountain and its reckless masters. A low, grinding hum began to pulse from the city's foundations, a sound that had been the mountain's steady heartbeat for generations. Then, with a series of sickening cracks, it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise. From his hidden grotto, Thrain felt the change like a physical blow. The supportive resonance that held his own pain at bay suddenly severed. The great harmonic resonators, ancient machines that translated the mountain's natural song into structural stability, had been silenced. Lord Boren's loyalists, in a final, desperate act to bury the truth, had chosen to collapse the city rather than surrender their power. The resulting tremors were not the deep groans of a dying mountain, but the violent, chaotic spasms of a body in seizure. Entire districts shook, their pillars groaning under the sudden, unbalanced strain. Thrain knew this was no natural disaster. It was a calculated murder of their home. He looked at the small, determined band of followers around him. They had no army, no weapons of war. They had only their voices and a fragment of a forgotten song. To try and reignite the resonators was to walk directly into the Lord's strongest grip. It was a trap, and they all knew it, yet the alternative was to watch their families be crushed in the rubble. We do not fight for a throne, Thrain told them, his voice cutting through the panic. We fight for the stone beneath our feet. We go to the central resonator chamber, and we will answer their sabotage with a song. The journey down was a descent into chaos. The grand passages leading to the foundations were choked with panicked citizens and falling debris, but the Lord's Guard had already sealed the resonator chamber itself, a cavernous hall deep in the mountain's heart. Thrain's group found a maintenance conduit, a tight, echoing shaft that bypassed the main doors. They emerged into the chamber just as another quake hit, the colossal, bell-like resonators swinging wildly on their stone mounts, silent and dead. The chamber was already occupied. A full contingent of Boren's personal guard stood in formation before the central resonator, their hammers and shields ready. Their commander stepped forward, his face a mask of cold certainty. "The heresy ends here, Stonehand. You will not defile this sacred place with your witchery." There was no parley, no grand speech. The battle was immediate and brutal. It was not a clash of armies, but a frantic, desperate scrum. Thrain's followers, mostly miners and artisans, used their tools and their knowledge of the uneven terrain to hold the line, creating a protective half-circle around their singer. Thrain ignored the clash of steel behind him, his entire being focused on the massive, silent bell of the central resonator. He placed his hands upon its cold, unresponsive metal and began to sing. It was not the Song of Mending or the Song of Unmaking. It was the first song, the simple, foundational note of connection Kalen had taught him. He poured his empathy, his shared pain with the mountain, into that single, pure tone. His followers, fighting for their lives, heard it. One by one, they began to add their own voices, not as trained singers, but as dwarves who loved their home. Their united song was rough and unpolished, a chorus of hope and defiance that filled the chamber. As their combined voices rose, a faint, answering hum began to emanate from the resonator. A soft, silver light flickered deep within its metal, growing brighter with each sustained note. The violent shaking in the district above began to subside, the tremors smoothing into a gentle, stable vibration. They had done it. They had reignited the heart of the city's stability, but the cost was counted in the still forms of friends lying on the chamber floor. As the last note faded, the guards, stunned by the display of raw, harmonious power, fell back. Their retreat was not a victory. It was a message. Thrain stood panting, his body trembling with exhaustion, surrounded by the survivors. They had won the chamber, but they had also shown their full hand. They had proven the power of the songs in open defiance of the throne. The temporary stability they had bought would be their only respite. The full, unrestrained wrath of the Dwarven Lords would now descend upon them, and there would be no more shadows left to hide in. The chamber's newfound stability was a fragile, fleeting thing. Thrain felt it in the shallow, brittle hum of the resonator, a vibration that was only an echo of the mountain's true voice. The deeper he delved into the stone tablet's secrets, the clearer the terrible price became. The lost songs were not mere melodies. They were circuits of immense power, and to channel them fully required a living conduit, a singer willing to bridge the gap between dwarf and mountain. The final act of harmony would demand a total surrender of the singer's own life force. It was not a battle he could walk away from. It was a funeral rite. The selfish part of him, the part that still feared the dark and cherished the memory of sunlight, screamed for him to flee, to take his few followers and find some deep, safe crevice to wait out the end. How could he ask others to follow him into a sacrifice he himself feared? The conflict was a cold stone in his gut, weighing down every step. Then, as he rested his forehead against the cool stone of the grotto wall, the mountain answered his turmoil. A vision, not of sound, but of pure sensation, flooded his mind. He saw the grand halls not as rubble, but as fine, choking dust. He felt the absolute, eternal silence where the hum of life had been. There were no screams, no final stands, only a vast and utter emptiness, a tomb of forgotten echoes. It was not an ending, it was an erasure. The vision shattered, leaving him gasping, the taste of dust in his mouth. In that moment of absolute desolation, His personal fear seemed small, a tiny candle flickering against an infinite, starless night. His own survival was meaningless if it was purchased with that nothingness. The choice was no longer a conflict. It was a terrible, clear duty. He would be the conduit. He would offer his life to the song, not as a martyr seeking glory, but as a final, desperate act of repair. His resolve, once fueled by anger and hope, was now forged into something colder and stronger, tempered by the acceptance of his own end. The path ahead was no longer a road he would walk, but a cord he would become, and he would hold it until there was either silence or a new song began. The path to the Hall of Whispers was a test of faith, not direction. Kalen's old maps showed a straight route, but the mountain itself seemed to resist them. The tunnels twisted back on themselves, and familiar rock formations would vanish when they looked away, replaced by dead ends that felt like a betrayal. Boren's mages had woven a tapestry of fear into the very stone, and the deeper they went, the more potent the illusions became. One of the miners, a stout dwarf named Oren, suddenly cried out and pointed a trembling finger at the wall. Where the others saw only solid granite, he saw a gaping fissure, a bottomless chasm that had supposedly swallowed his brother years ago. He backed away, his eyes wide with a terror that was utterly real to him. Thrain did not try to reason with him. He knew that logic was a weak weapon against magic that fed on memory and grief. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between Oren and the illusory abyss. He closed his eyes and began to hum the seeking tone, but he reshaped its purpose. He did not send it out to find a void, but to find truth. The note was a gentle, probing vibration that washed over the wall. The air shimmered, and for a moment, the terrifying chasm and the unyielding stone flickered in and out of existence, locked in a silent war. Then, with a soft sound like a sigh, the illusion unraveled. The chasm was gone, leaving only the familiar, solid tunnel wall. Oren slumped in relief, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at Thrain with a new, profound gratitude. This was the pattern of their journey. Another follower would freeze, convinced the ceiling was collapsing upon them. Thrain would sing a note of stability, his voice growing hoarser with each effort, and reveal the ceiling was intact, its perceived movement a cruel trick of the mind. The magical traps did not attack their bodies, they attacked their spirits, seeking to turn their own doubts into weapons. With each illusion dispelled, the bond between Thrain and his small band grew stronger. They were no longer just followers of a cause, but companions who had faced their deepest fears together and been pulled back from the brink by a single, steady voice. Yet Thrain could feel the cost. Every note he sang to calm their terror was a thread of his own life force, spent not in mending the mountain, but in simply keeping their hope alive. He was a lamp burning its oil to light the way for others, growing dimmer with each step. When they finally broke through the last veil of magic, the entrance to the Hall of Whispers was not a grand archway, but a simple, natural opening in the rock. From within came a sound that made them all fall silent. It was the clear, untroubled voice of the mountain, a gentle, harmonic hum that spoke of a time before the drills, before the poison, a memory of perfect health. They had found their sanctuary, but Thrain leaned heavily against the stone, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had guided them through the labyrinth of their own fears, but the greatest trial, the one that would demand everything he had left, was waiting for him inside. The gentle hum of the Hall of Whispers was a lie. Their sanctuary felt secure, but their supplies were vanishing. Rations meant to last for weeks dwindled in a single night. Freshwater skins were found slashed, their precious contents soaking into the unfeeling stone. The sabotage was an inside job, a poison drop in their well of trust. Thrain watched his small band, seeing the suspicion growing in their eyes, a new fracture more dangerous than any in the rock. He knew the traitor was among them, and that the next attack would not be on their supplies, but on their lives. He laid a trap, whispering a false plan to seek an artifact in the crystal caves, a place of perfect acoustics. He then waited in the echoing darkness, his few true followers hidden around him. The ambush came exactly as he feared. Boren's guards, led by one of their own, a miner named Corgan, whom Thrain had personally pulled from the trade tunnel collapse, stormed into the cavern. The betrayal was a physical blow, colder than any deep stone chill. Corgan stood with the Lord's guard, his face a mask of conflicted shame, but his hammer held ready. Thrain stepped from the shadows, not raising a weapon. He looked not at the guards, but directly at Corgan. "You were my friend," Thrain said, his voice echoing in the crystalline space. "Let the mountain hear your truth." He did not sing a note of force or compulsion. He began the Song of Revelation, the same piercing harmony he had used on the Corrupted Heartstone. But this time, he aimed its pure, exposing light not at stone, but at a dwarf's soul. The note washed over Corgan, and the miner staggered, his weapon clattering to the floor. He did not fight it. The song stripped away his lies, his fear, his promised rewards from Boren. The truth poured out of him in a choked, horrified confession. Boren knows he cannot hold the city. If the lower districts rise, Corgan gasped, his eyes wide with the horror of his own words. His final plan is not to defend the throne, but to collapse the entire lower city. He has placed volatile sun steel charges in the foundational pillars. He will bury the rebellion and everyone in it under a mountain of rubble. The Lord's guard, hearing their master's ultimate treachery spoken aloud, hesitated. This was not the noble cause they had been told. In that moment of stunned silence, Thrain's followers disarmed them. Corgan was not slain, but was cast out into the tunnels, left to carry the weight of his betrayal alone. The hard-won knowledge was a victory that tasted of ashes. Thrain looked at the faces of his remaining comrades, the ones who had not faltered. He knew he could trust them with his life. But the deeper trust, the simple faith that had held their community together, was gone, shattered by a single, willing knife in the dark. From that moment on, every shared glance was measured, every offered hand viewed with a sliver of doubt. The path to salvation was now a tightrope, and he could only trust the few hands already holding the line. The geode chamber took their breath away. It was a vast, hollow sphere, deep within the mountain's heart, its walls a crust of jagged, dark rock. But the inside was a terrifying marvel. The entire dome was lined with colossal, perfect crystals, each one pulsating with a feverish, golden light. This was not the gentle hum of the Hall of Whispers. This was the corrupted core itself, a sick heart beating with the poison of the sun steel. In the center of the cavern hung the adamantine spine, the mountain's structural anchor, now webbed with the same corrosive gold, its once silver light dim and struggling. Thrain knew this was the source of all the sickness, the infection point from which every tremor and fracture spread. His small band formed a protective circle around him as he stepped toward the shuddering spine. He drew a deep breath, preparing to weave the three lost songs together into a single, purifying chord, a final plea to the mountain spirit. But the first note had not even left his lips when the chamber's main entrance, a massive stone door they believed sealed for centuries, exploded inward in a shower of rock and dust. Lord Boren stood framed in the wreckage, his elite guard flanking him, their armor gleaming in the sickly light. He did not look at Thrain's followers. His eyes were locked on the pulsating core, burning with a possessive, desperate hunger. "You see, Stonehand," he roared, his voice echoing over the groaning crystals. "You call it poison, but I see its true nature. Raw, untamed power. You would sing it back to sleep, but I will wake it fully. I will harness this energy, and with it, I will forge an empire that will never fall." This was not a clash over mining rights or political control. It was a fundamental war of philosophy, a battle for the mountain's very soul. Boren saw a resource to be dominated. Thrain saw a living entity to be healed. Boren gestured, and his guards surged forward, not toward Thrain, but toward the adamantine spine itself. They carried not weapons, but arcane conduits, focusing rods meant to latch onto the core and siphon its volatile energy. Thrain's group met their charge. The fight was brutal and chaotic, a desperate scrum in the unstable cavern. There were no grand duels, only a frantic struggle to keep the guards away from the sacred stone. Thrain knew he could not fight and sing the ritual. His followers bought him seconds with their lives, creating a wall of flesh and resolve between the invaders and their goal. He turned back to the spine, his hands trembling as he placed them on the burning crystal. He had to try. He opened his mouth, and the first notes of the unified song, a complex harmony of empathy, revelation, and unmaking, spilled into the air. The crystals in the chamber flared in response, their light shifting from sickly gold to a volatile, blinding white. The very air began to crackle with power. Boren watched, a triumphant sneer on his face as his sorcerer, Morwen, directed the guards to plant the first focusing rod against the spine. The moment the metal touched the crystal, the mountain screamed. A shockwave of raw, corrupted energy erupted from the point of contact, throwing dwarves from both sides to the ground. The purification had begun, but it was now tangled with Boren's forced extraction, a catastrophic interference that threatened to tear the mountain apart from the inside out. Thrain's voice rose in a desperate crescendo, weaving the three lost songs into one terrible harmony. It was the Song of Sundering, a plea for release, and the mountain answered with a shriek of tortured stone. The chamber convulsed, crystals detonating like suns. Boren's focusing rods, mere inches from the adamantine spine, glowed white-hot and then exploded into shrapnel. A wave of pure, uncontrolled force erupted from the core, throwing the Lord back like a leaf in a gale. He crashed against the geode wall, the very power he had sought to master, now crushing the life from him. His armor was scorched and broken, his grand ambition ending not with a crown, but with a final, rattling gasp. But the release was a double-edged sword. The violent discharge of corrupted energy had torn through the mountain's last defenses. The groans of the deeps became a continuous, deafening roar as entire sections of the city began to pancake into the abyss. The stability Thrain had fought so hard to create was unraveling in seconds. He stood, battered and breathless, the song still echoing in the disintegrating chamber. Boren was gone, but his final, reckless act had lit the fuse on their doom. Thrain's followers looked to him, their faces pale with terror and hope. There was no time to mourn, no time to rest. The ritual was only half finished, a chaotic release without the necessary healing. To stop now was to surrender to the collapse. He had to complete the song, to turn that scream of sundering into a whisper of mending, before the last note was drowned out by the sound of the world falling apart. The chamber was coming apart around them, a deafening symphony of shattering crystal and grinding stone. Thrain's voice, already strained to its limit, was a single thread against the roar. He turned to his followers, his eyes locking with each of theirs, and with a final, gasping breath, he gave the only command that could save them. "Join me," he cried out over the chaos. "Give the mountain your voice." Without hesitation, they formed a tight circle around the shuddering adamantine spine, their hands linked, their faces pale but resolute. They were not trained singers. They were miners, artisans, and fighters. Yet as the first one added his rough, untuned baritone to Thrain's melody, something shifted. Another voice joined, then another, a third, until their combined chorus wove around Thrain's lead, amplifying it, giving it a strength no single singer could ever possess. Their unity became a conduit, focusing the lost songs into a final, cleansing harmony that washed over the corrupted heartstone. The sickly gold veins pulsed violently, resisting the purity of the sound. But the chorus held, their shared willow bulwark against the poison. As the song reached its peak, the immense strain of channeling such power became horrifically visible. Thin, glowing fissures, like cracks in hot ceramic, began to spread across Thrain's skin, starting at his hands and racing up his arms. A searing light bled from the fractures, the very energy of his life being spent to fuel the ritual. He screamed, but it was a scream woven into the song, a note of ultimate sacrifice. He saw the terror in the eyes of his companions, saw one start to pull away, but he shook his head, his gaze unwavering. He would not stop. He could not stop. He pushed deeper, pouring every last shred of his being into the harmony, until the golden corruption in the spine flickered, dimmed, and then, with a sound like a great, relieved sigh, dissolved into nothingness. The violent tremors ceased. The mountain's agonized groans softened, replaced by a deep, stable, and healthy hum that resonated through the stone and into their very bones. The adamantine spine now glowed with a clean, silver light, its true nature restored. Thrain stood for a single, perfect moment at the center of the circle, his body a map of luminous cracks. Then, his purpose fulfilled, he crumbled silently to the floor, the last note of the song fading with him into the peaceful, living stone. The hum that filled the mountain now was ancient and clean, a vibration that resonated not with agony, but with profound, settling peace. Then the wave came. It was not a tremor of destruction, but a tide of pure, harmonic energy released from the purified core, a final, gentle sigh from a healed heart. It washed upward through the stone, a soft, silver luminescence that flowed through every fracture and foundation. In its wake, the grand spires and opulent halls of the Dwarven Lords, those monuments to ambition built upon a poisoned foundation, could no longer stand. They did not explode or shatter violently. They simply subsided, towering arches of carved marble sighed and settled into elegant rubble. Gilded domes descended with a weary grace, folding in on themselves like flowers at the end of a long day. It was a quiet, inevitable collapse, the mountain gently shrugging off the weight of its arrogant masters. For the survivors huddled in the lower districts, the sight was not one of terror, but of awe. They watched the symbols of 1,000 years of unchallenged power dissolve into dust, not with the roar of conquest, but with the whisper of a natural conclusion. The reign of the Lords was not overthrown by hammer or axe. It was outgrown, its foundations proven as hollow as the promises they were built upon. From the settling dust, a new and daunting reality emerged. The path forward was clear, a road leading not to a throne, but to a future they would have to build themselves, stone by patient stone, guided by the mountain's true song. But that road was fraught with perils far different from cave-ins or monsters. How do you govern when the old laws have turned to dust? How do you lead when the only model you have is one of tyranny? The survivors now faced the most difficult task of all, the task of learning how to be free. The dust-choked silence was a new kind of sound. Thrain stood at the heart of the stabilized core, his body a testament to the cost of their victory. The luminous cracks that had threatened to consume him were now faded scars, a permanent map of the sacrifice he had been willing to make. He was alive not by his own power, but because his followers had shared the burden, their combined voices forming a living shield that absorbed the fatal cost. They had not saved a king, they had saved a teacher. The society that emerged from the rubble was fundamentally changed. The old hierarchies lay buried with the opulent halls, leaving a people humbled and united by shared survival. They did not look to Thrain for commands or decrees. They looked to him for understanding. They asked him how to listen to the stone, how to build in harmony with its song, rather than in defiance of its strength. He walked among them not as a ruler, but as a guide, showing them how to place a foundation stone so it resonated with the deep hum, how to choose a quarry vein that sang with health, not sickness. The immediate danger of collapse had passed, but the true work was only just beginning. Rebuilding a civilization is more than stacking stone upon stone. It is about rebuilding trust, redefining purpose, and learning a new language of coexistence. Every decision was a collective one, debated not in a throne room, but in the open air of the reclaimed plazas, with the mountain's steady pulse as their only constant witness. The legacy of the Dwarven Lords was a cautionary whisper in the wind, a reminder that true strength is found not in domination, but in dialogue. And as the first new structures began to rise, their designs flowing with the natural contours of the rock, a question lingered in the hearts of every dwarf. Could they truly learn from the echoes of the past, or were they destined to repeat its oldest, most devastating notes? The first stones of the new city were not granite or marble, but a quiet, shared resolve. Thrain and Anya stood together on the raw, leveled ground, not as rulers, but as architects of a fragile peace. The council they envisioned was a radical departure from the old ways. It was a circle, not a pyramid. When the first assembly gathered, it was not in a gilded chamber, but in the open air of the foundation site. Seated among the surviving elders were master masons, whose hands knew the stone's grain, miners who could feel a tremor through their boots, and yes, stone singers like Thrain, whose very art was a language of listening. Anya, representing the forge works and the practical needs of daily life, ensured that every voice, from the deepest delver to the market crafter, held weight. This was the core of their new foundation. The mountain's voice would no longer be a single, ignored whisper in a sealed chamber. It would be a chorus, woven directly into the fabric of their governance. A decision on where to quarry would now involve a miner's report, a stone singer's harmonic assessment, and a crafter's evaluation of the material's quality, all debated openly until a true consensus emerged. This process was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but it was honest. It healed the old divisions not by erasing them, but by making them irrelevant. The old loyalty to a lord was replaced by a new loyalty to the community and the living stone that sheltered it. As the first foundational block was set into place, its alignment checked against the mountain's deep, stable hum. It was more than a construction milestone. It was a promise, carved not in runes of command, but in the simple, enduring act of building together. The city that would rise here would not scrape the sky in defiance, but would nestle within the mountain's embrace, its structures singing in gentle harmony with the world around them. A lasting peace was no longer a hope, but a daily practice, laid down one careful stone at a time. The first lesson of the Stone Singer Academy was not a song, but a moment of shared silence. Thrain guided his new students, young and old, to a quiet grotto and simply asked them to listen. He taught them to distinguish the mountain's peaceful hum from the subtle stress of a settling foundation, the joyful resonance of a clean water vein from the dissonant groan of a strained pillar. This was the foundation of everything, the art of listening before ever attempting to speak. The academy was not built to create an elite class of magic wielders, but to cultivate a society of listeners, ensuring the hard-won knowledge of the lost songs would be woven into the very fabric of their culture, passed down through generations as a common inheritance. This reawakening sparked a cultural renaissance that touched every aspect of dwarven life. Artisans began composing simple harmonic chants to accompany their work, finding that a stonemason's rhythmic hum could guide his chisel to follow the natural grain of the rock, creating structures that were stronger and more beautiful. Miners learned to tap a pick against a seam and interpret the returning echo, avoiding unstable pockets and locating the purest ore with an almost instinctual grace. The connection to the stone was no longer a mysterious, forbidden art, but a daily practice, a second language spoken by an entire people. New melodies were born from this deep engagement, songs for encouraging the growth of the glowing moss that lit their halls, and harmonies to gently guide the flow of fresh water through ancient aquifers. The future no longer echoed with the grim prophecies of collapse, but with the vibrant, living promise of a civilization finally learning to sing in tune with the world it called home. The new bridge arched gracefully over the underground chasm, its stones still fresh from the quarry. Thrain stood back, his own singing days now a quiet memory, and watched a young apprentice step forward. She placed her hands on the central keystone, closed her eyes, and began to hum. The note was not perfect, but it was true, a clear and confident resonance that flowed into the stone. As she sang, a soft, silver light traced the lines of a rune of strengthening, and the entire structure seemed to settle with a deep, contented sigh, its bond with the living rock now complete. In that simple, successful act, Thrain saw the unbroken chain. The legacy of the lost songs was no longer a secret guarded by a desperate few, but but a living tradition, learned and adapted by a new generation. It was stronger now than it had ever been in isolation. The profound fulfillment that washed over him was not pride, but a quiet peace. His long and painful journey, with all its sacrifice and fear, had found its ultimate purpose not in a single moment of salvation, but in this endless continuity. He had not just saved a city, he had helped plant a seed that would grow long after he was dust. The true strength of a people lies not in the monuments they build, but in the wisdom they choose to pass down. The new bridge stood strong, its song a steady hum in the stone, yet a restless dissonance began to itch at the edge of Thrain's awareness. During his morning meditations, a faint, unfamiliar tremor would ripple through the mountain's deep hum, a harmonic disturbance so subtle it felt like a single, sour note in a grand symphony. It echoed from the deepest, unexplored caverns, places so ancient they were absent from even the oldest maps, realms where the mountain's own song seemed to fray into whispers. This was not the old, familiar pain of a healing wound, but something new, a quiet call from the abyss. He could have dismissed it, clinging to the hard-won peace he had helped build. His students were capable, the city was stable, and his own body bore the permanent scars of his sacrifice. But to ignore this whisper would be to betray the very principle he now taught, the sacred duty of listening. His work as a guardian was never truly done. With a quiet resolve, he selected a small pack and a single, well-worn hammer. He left no grand pronouncements, only a simple note for Anya and his most trusted apprentice. The path downward was not one of flight, but of quiet pursuit, a choice to follow a mystery into the darkness. The mountain was alive, and its deepest heart still held secrets waiting for a listener brave enough to hear them. The new harmonic disturbance was a persistent, discordant hum beneath the mountain's steady song. Thrain gathered his most trusted stone singers in a chamber, shaped like a giant ear, its curved walls designed to amplify the subtlest of vibrations. Together, they did not sing, but listened, their combined focus a single, probing instrument aimed at the abyss. They wove their individual perceptions into a collective resonance, a net of pure attention cast into the deep. The pattern that echoed back was not random noise. It was structured, repetitive, a complex sequence of harmonic pulses that conveyed a profound and ancient suffering. It was a language of pure emotion, a distress call. The realization settled upon them with the weight of a falling mountain. This was not a geological event. It was the cry of an earth spirit, one of the primordial beings that had slumbered within the stone since the world's dawn. The Lord's reckless mining and the sun steel's poison had not just cracked the rock, it had created a spiritual prison, ensnaring this ancient consciousness in a web of its own agony. The silence in the chamber was heavier than any stone. Their hard-won peace had been a surface calm. Beneath it, a foundational tragedy was still unfolding. This changed everything. Their responsibility now stretched beyond their own city, beyond their own people. They were the listeners, and they had heard a cry for help from the very soul of the world. A new mission took shape, one far more perilous than reinforcing a pillar or calming a tremor. They would have to journey into realms where their refined songs might be mere whispers against a gale of primordial despair. This was the true test of their unity and their art, a quest not for survival, but for healing a wound at the heart of existence. The stone of the ritual chamber was slick with a cold sweat of pure dread. Thrain stood at the precipice of a chasm that was not physical, but spiritual, the source of the dissonant hum that had called him from his peace. Below him, in the realm of pure resonance, the trapped earth spirit raged. It was a storm of ancient, wounded fury, its pain so vast it threatened to unravel the mountain's newfound stability from the inside out. The old songs of mending or unmaking were useless here. This was not a broken thing to be fixed, but a living consciousness to be understood. Thrain closed his eyes, and with his fellow singers supporting him, he began the newest and most fragile of their rediscovered arts, the Song of Empathy. It held no commands, no pleas for strength. It was a melody of pure, shared feeling, a harmonic bridge built from their own memories of loss, fear, and the desperate hope for release. They did not sing at the spirit, they sang with it, weaving their own vulnerability into its tempest of anguish. For a terrifying moment, the spirit's rage intensified, as if rejecting this unfamiliar gentleness. Then a shift occurred, subtle as a sigh. The chaotic dissonance began to slow, its sharp edges softening. The spirit was listening. It was recognizing a kindred pain, a language it had not heard since the world was young. As the final note of empathy faded, a profound silence fell, deeper than any they had known. Then, from the heart of the chasm, a new sound emerged, a single, clear, harmonious tone of gratitude and release. The earth spirit, finally unbound, rose not as a destructive force, but as a wave of pure, creative energy. It flowed through the mountain's deepest fractures, and where it passed, the stone did not merely heal. It transformed, veins of living crystal, glowing with a soft, internal light, threaded through the foundations, weaving a lattice of strength, more resilient than any dwarven engineering. The mountain was not just stable, it was alive in a way it had not been for millennia. This was the final proof, the ultimate answer to the old conflict. The dwarves had not dominated their home, nor merely placated it. They had listened, understood, and in doing so, had earned a gift of protection that could never be forged in a fire, only born from a shared heart. True symbiosis was no longer a theory, but a living, breathing, crystalline reality. The great eastern face of the mountain, once a blank canvas of granite, now echoed with the rhythmic tap of master carvers. Under Thrain and Anya's direction, they did not build a monument to a single ruler, but inscribed a chronicle for all people. This was the Chronicle of Stone, a massive epic, carved into the living rock, that told the true story of the fall of the Lords and the long, painful recovery of the songs. Every figure was rendered with care, from the arrogant lords in their crumbling halls to the desperate miners in the collapsing tunnels, and the small, defiant circle of singers around the trembling adamantine spine. The carving was not meant to glorify or to condemn, but to remember with stark and unflinching honesty. It showed the poison of the sun's steel veins and the cost of the final ritual, with Thrain's luminous, cracking form forever captured in the moment of ultimate sacrifice. This was their history, set in stone for any who cared to look. The act of creating it became a unifying ritual in itself, a shared project that healed the last remnants of division. Dwarves from every former district and craft came to watch the progress, to point out a relative in the grand tableau, or simply to feel the solidity of their shared past, made permanent. The story was no longer a whispered secret or a traumatic memory. It was a testament, a physical proof that they had faced annihilation and had chosen to listen, to unite, and to rebuild. How does a people ensure their hardest lessons are never forgotten? They carve them into the heart of their home. The Chronicle transformed their collective memory from a tale of tragedy into a permanent declaration of resilience. It stood as a silent teacher for every new generation, a reminder that their strength was not in the gold they mined, but in the harmony they cultivated. The mountain itself now held the story, and its steady hum was the soundtrack to their enduring legacy. A new melody began to form in Thrain's mind, a quiet hum at first, then a clear and flowing harmony. It was not a memory pulled from the ancient tablets, but a fresh composition, born from the Earth Spirit's grateful release. This was the Song of Blossoming, the first new Song of Stone in centuries. He did not sing to command or to mend, but simply to reflect the vibrant, living energy now flowing through the mountain's veins. As the final notes drifted through the great cavern, the stone itself answered. Along the walls, where only damp rock and pale moss had clung before, delicate crystalline flowers began to unfold. Their petals were not of plant, but of living amethyst and citrine, each one catching the cavern's soft light and refracting it into a gentle, colorful glow. The air itself seemed to brighten, carrying a fresh, ozonic scent like the world after a storm. This was not the old magic of reinforcement or desperate healing. It was a magic of pure, joyful expression, a symbol of a new balance where growth and stability were no longer opposing forces, but partners in the same beautiful dance. The dwarves who witnessed it understood the shift in their very souls. They were no longer mere dwellers within the mountain, extracting its wealth and fearing its tremors. They were gardeners in a living realm, partners in a continuous, creative conversation. The crystalline blooms were more than a beautiful spectacle. They were a promise. Every new song, every act of careful listening, could now yield a unique and unexpected gift, weaving the dwarves' own creativity directly into the heart of their home. The title was not a crown, but a covenant. Thrain Stonehand became the keeper of the deep, a name that held no throne and commanded no armies. His vigil was a solitary promise made to the mountain itself, a pledge that its heart would never again beat unheard. He established his watch in a simple chamber near the adamantine spine, a space with no ornamentation, save for the soft, silver pulse of the living crystal. His duty was not to command, but to listen, to serve as an early sentinel against any future deafness, any creeping arrogance that might whisper of easier paths and greater conquests. This was his final and most profound lesson to his people. True leadership is not the exercise of power, but the acceptance of a sacred responsibility. By choosing the silence of the deep over the acclaim of the halls above, he embodied the hard-won humility that now defined their civilization. His watch began not with a fanfare, but with a quiet breath, a lifelong commitment to ensuring the echoes of the past would forever guide their future steps. The final choice was not between life and death, but between two kinds of existence. Before Thrain, the mountain's corrupted core pulsed like a wounded star, its poisoned light offering a terrible temptation. He could feel the path to domination laid bare. With a single, selfish command, he could seize that volatile energy, fuse it with his own mastery of the songs, and become a living god king, unassailable and eternal. The power to never be ignored again, to never feel fear, whispered to the deepest, most hidden part of his soul. For one agonizing heartbeat, the allure of that absolute security was a physical ache. Then he looked past the glow into the heart of the sickness. He saw not power, but the lingering poison that would forever taint their future, a throne built upon a foundation of slow decay. His own salvation would mean the mountain's perpetual servitude. The right choice was also the cruelest. To achieve a true and lasting purification, the conduit itself had to be pure. The magic of the songs, the very power that defined him, was a filter through which the energy passed. To save the mountain, he had to shatter that filter. He had to become ordinary again. His hands, which had once hummed with the resonance of living stone, would never feel that connection again. He would be just Thrain, a simple craftsman, his greatest work forever behind him. The cost was everything he was. Without a second thought, he raised his rune chisel, the focus of his life's art, the tool that had carved his first rune and his last hope. He did not plunge it into the stone to command it. He brought it down upon the Heartstone with all his strength, and the ancient, enchanted tool shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. In that breaking, a final, perfect wave of unconditional energy was released. It was a harmony without a singer, a gift with no demand for repayment. The wave washed through the core, and the corrosive gold of the sun's steel vanished, not with a scream, but with the quiet of a sigh. The adamantine spine blazed with a clean, silver radiance, and the mountain's tremors stilled into a deep, unshakable peace. Thrain felt the songs leave him, not as a theft, but as a gentle release, like a breath he had been holding for a lifetime. The hum of the stone faded from his senses, leaving behind only the simple, solid feel of rock beneath his hands. He was empty, he was free, he was home. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of earth and crystalline flowers, whispered through the tranquil gardens. Thrain Stonehand sat on a simple bench, his hands resting on his knees. They were just hands now, the callous tools of a craftsman, no longer humming with the resonance of living stone. The loss of his gift was a quiet emptiness he carried within him, a hollow space where a mountain once lived. Yet, as he listened, the emptiness was filled with a different kind of music. From the open windows of the Stone-singer Academy, the voices of young apprentices rose in a clear, confident harmony. They sang the songs of mending, their notes weaving strength into a new archway. They practiced the seeking tone, their voices probing the deep foundations with a skill that now surpassed his own. These were the echoes of his life's work, not fading, but growing stronger with each new generation. His journey had begun with a single, desperate chisel stroke against an unyielding spire, a lone voice howling into the deafness of power. He had been a catalyst, not a king, a spark that ignited a fire of renewal. The fall of the Dwarven Lords was not an ending, but a necessary crumbling, the shedding of a brittle shell to make way for something more resilient. The dwarves who remained, who had chosen to listen and to learn, had been forged in that collapse. They were bound to the living stone, not by chains of command, but by threads of shared song, their future secured not by walls of granite, but by an unbreakable covenant of care. The true legacy of Thrain Stonehand was not written in any chronicle, but was sung in the voices of children, echoing through the deep places, ensuring the mountain would never again have to groan alone.
you.